I never imagined that the ugliest betrayal in my family wouldn't come from greed, jealousy, or the usual fractures that widen with age. No, the moment that broke everything came wrapped in something far worse. A secret. A secret my father planned, executed, and safeguarded for nearly 10 years. Until the day my siblings cornered me in the parking lot behind Whitford and Sons Hardware, their faces strung tight with confusion and betrayal. They had just learned, through a loophole in a public records search, that I, quiet, reliable, never rocking the boat me, was the legal owner of the family business. Not them. Not all of us. Just me. They stood there, rage simmering beneath a stunned disbelief, while I held the papers that proved the truth. Dad had sold the entire business to me privately, quietly, and intentionally. And my siblings thought I had stolen it. They thought I had manipulated him. They thought I'd betrayed them all. I remember the way my brother Mark jabbed a trembling finger toward me and asked, "Why didn't you tell us? Why would you do something like this?" And I remember how the words caught in my throat because I truly didn't know how to answer. The ink on the deal was barely dry in my memory, even though a decade had already passed. I hadn't told them because I didn't know what to say. I hadn't told them because Dad made me promise not to. I hadn't told them because I believed, foolishly, that the time to explain would come gently, naturally, in his own words, before it became a landmine under our feet. But Dad died before he ever said a word. And now the ticking bomb had finally gone off. As my siblings waited for an answer I didn't have, I realized something with a cold clarity that ran through me like a blade. If I didn't fight for the truth, they would bury me under their assumptions. And Dad, whether intentionally or not, had left me to face the aftermath alone. But I wasn't going to crumble. Not this time. Not after everything I'd carried. Not after everything I'd been asked to sacrifice. This was the moment everything began to unravel. And it was the moment I decided I would no longer be the quiet one in the background. My name is Eleanor Whitford, and I am 63 years old. I say that with a strange kind of pride, because every year has added something I've needed: wisdom, calm, steadiness, and a sharper sense of what matters. For most of my life, I've been the eldest child, the reliable daughter, the one who stayed behind when others left. I lived in the same small Midwestern town where my parents built their livelihood, raised all 4 of us, and poured every ounce of energy into Whitford and Sons Hardware, even though 2 of the sons turned out to be daughters. I suppose I always knew I was different from my siblings. Not better, not worse. Just carved at a different angle. Where they were bold, I was cautious. Where they chased their ambitions outward, I set my roots inward. I spent my life nearby, helping the store grow, managing it when Dad's knees began to ache and Mom's memory began to skip like a scratched record. I did the unglamorous things, the bookkeeping, the early morning inventory counts, the late-night vendor calls, the quiet mediations whenever family tempers ran high. But there is a kind of power in being the quiet one. People forget you're paying attention. I married once. Widowed young. No children. The store became my routine, my anchor, and eventually my refuge when grief dimmed the rest of my world. Dad understood that in his own gruff, unsentimental way. He'd pat my shoulder and say, "You've got a mind like a steel trap, Ellie. This place is better because of you." But he never said it in front of my siblings. Maybe that was the first fracture. Or maybe the fracture began long before, the day Dad told all of us, firmly, definitively, that the business would always stay in the family, owned equally by his children. We believed him. We carried that promise into adulthood as though it were scripture. I certainly did. So when the truth finally surfaced, when it became clear he'd made me the sole owner through a private sale, without a single word to the others, it didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a burden wrapped in barbed wire. And yet, beneath all the confusion and guilt, something else stirred. A quiet sense of knowing. A clarity I had never before allowed myself to acknowledge. I had earned his trust. But my siblings weren't going to see it that way. Not without a storm. We were 4 Whitford children raised under the same roof but shaped by entirely different interpretations of what family meant. Mark, 2 years younger than me, Inherited Dad's stubbornness and Mom's ability to turn a single grievance into a 5-act drama. He left town after college, returned only when it suited him, and insisted, loudly, that he was Dad's natural successor. He loved the idea of leadership far more than the work that came with it. Then there were the twins, Clara and James, 10 years younger than I am. 2 babies who grew up under a different version of my parents. Older, softer, more permissive. I spent my teenage years babysitting them, losing my Saturday nights to diaper bags and scraped knees, while Dad kept the store open late and Mom took double shifts at the hospital. The twins adored me as children, tolerated me as teens, and gradually grew into adults who believed the universe would always bend to accommodate their wants. And perhaps it always had. Until now. Our family dinners were always a peculiar blend of affection and unspoken tension. Dad at the head of the table, presiding like a king with a calloused grip on tradition. Mom smiling gently, smoothing over every sharp edge, pretending not to sense the rivalries simmering beneath the surface. Dad loved all 4 of us, but not equally. I know that now, though I didn't want to know it then. He trusted me. Not in an emotional way. Dad was not a man who traded in feelings, but in the practical, enduring way of a man who recognized competence, loyalty, and consistency. I didn't ask for that trust. I certainly didn't expect it to come with a private sale contract and a clause forbidding disclosure until his death. Yes. He added that. He made me promise not to tell them. And they'll resent you for it, he'd said one evening, 2 years before he passed. But they'll resent you even more if they think I didn't make the decision myself. At the time, I thought he was worried about family tension. I didn't realize he was handing me the fuse of a bomb. Maybe he thought they'd understand. Maybe he believed they'd eventually appreciate the years I spent keeping the business afloat when he couldn't. Maybe he assumed they'd remember who showed up when the roof leaked, when the suppliers threatened to pull their accounts, when the recession hit, when bankruptcy loomed like a shadow no one dared name. But Dad never told them any of that. And so my siblings believed what was easiest to believe, that I had taken something from them, that I had betrayed them. And I knew then that whatever came next, whatever unraveling awaited us, would test every bond we ever had. The betrayal wasn't the sale itself. It wasn't even the secrecy. No, the betrayal came later, festering quietly until the day the twins found an online record of the transaction and brought it straight to Mark, whose temper burned hotter than either of them could ever manage alone. What followed was a storm. They walked into the store that afternoon with faces set like stone, their footsteps echoing through the narrow aisles until they found me in the back office. They shut the door. Clara held the printed record in her hand like a weapon. "Explain," she demanded. "I wish I could say I was prepared. I wasn't. I wish I could say I handled it gracefully. I didn't." I froze, caught between loyalty to my father and the reality that the truth was more complicated than a single conversation could solve. Mark leaned forward, jaw tight. He said the business would stay in the family. He promised it. And now we find out he sold it. Sold it, to you? What did you do, Eleanor? There it was. The accusation. I felt the floor tilt as something inside me snapped. Not anger, not fear, but a quiet exhaustion from carrying a secret that was never mine to hold in the first place. "I didn't do anything," I said. But the moment the words left my mouth, I knew they wouldn't believe me. They saw the sale price. They saw the date. They saw Dad's signature. And they saw my silence as guilt. The worst part. They assumed I got the business for free. They assumed favoritism. They assumed deceit. They didn't know I spent nearly all my savings to buy it from him. They didn't know I had taken on a private loan to cover the rest. They didn't know I had spent the next 5 years repaying every cent, sometimes skipping meals so I could make the monthly note without penalties. They didn't know because I had kept my promise. My siblings stormed out that day with one final threat: "You'll hear from our lawyer." And I did. A week later, a demand letter arrived, accusing me of coercion, fraud, and elder manipulation. They claimed Dad lacked capacity. They claimed the sale violated his stated intention. They claimed I had abused my role as the child who lived closest. They wanted the business dissolved. They wanted compensation. They wanted everything. Dad's secret had turned into my battlefield. And even then, I still didn't know the full extent of the truth he'd hidden from us. When their lawyer's letter arrived, something inside me steadied. Fear was still there, but beneath it grew a quiet resolve. I was tired of being misunderstood. Tired of protecting a promise that had only brought me pain. Tired of carrying a burden that didn't belong solely to me. So I hired my own attorney, an older woman named Marjorie whose voice carried the weight of 3 decades in small-town litigation. She listened to every detail of the story, asked precise questions, and then leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled beneath her chin. "You kept meticulous records, didn't you?" she asked. "I did," I said. "Good. Because facts will win this." We began gathering documents, the contract of sale notarized and properly executed, the loan records, the proof of payment, my financial ledgers showing every installment I had repaid, emails between Dad and me discussing inventory strategies, renovation plans, staffing needs, the quiet paper trail of a partnership built on mutual trust and shared responsibility. But the most significant piece of evidence came from an unexpected place. Dad's old desk. I hadn't opened the bottom drawer since the day he passed. It felt invasive then, too much like rifling through a life still warm. But now, with my family's accusations hanging over me like storm clouds, I forced the lock open and began pulling out folders, envelopes, and brittle scraps of notes written in Dad's unmistakable blocky handwriting. In the back corner lay an unmarked envelope. Inside it was a letter. Not addressed. Not dated. But clearly meant for us, his children. He explained everything. His reasons. His fears. His intentions. He detailed the financial crisis the business had faced years earlier, a crisis he hid from my siblings because he knew they'd either panic or abandon ship. He wrote about the nights he nearly lost the store, the nights I stayed up reworking budgets and negotiating with suppliers to keep the doors open. He wrote that I was the only one who had consistently shown the discipline, patience, and commitment to ensure the business survived. He wrote that selling the store to me wasn't favoritism. It was survival. And then, near the end, a single line nearly broke me. "I know they won't understand this now. But when the time comes, show them the truth, and they will see you were always the one who kept this family afloat." But he never gave me the chance to show them. Now I had the evidence. Now I had the truth. But winning legally was never the real battle. The real battle was reclaiming my own story from the assumptions my siblings had built around me like a cage. And I was finally ready to step out. The turning point didn't come in a courtroom or through a heated confrontation. It came in a quiet moment in my kitchen, as I sat at the table holding Dad's letter beneath the warm glow of the overhead light. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel the truth fully. Dad trusted me because I had earned it. He hadn't used me. He hadn't betrayed the others arbitrarily. He hadn't chosen me to hurt them. He had chosen me because he saw me. And I realized I no longer had to carry the weight of everyone's expectations silently. I didn't have to apologize for something I didn't do wrong. I didn't have to shrink myself so my siblings could feel taller. I decided then that I would face them calmly, truth in hand, with no anger in my voice and no fear clouding my judgment. I invited them to a meeting at the store after hours. I told them to bring their lawyer. I told them I would bring mine. When they arrived, the tension was palpable, resentment clinging to them like smoke. Their lawyer was sharp, confident, certain they were walking into an easy victory. But I didn't go on the defensive. I didn't justify. I didn't plead. I presented the documents. The receipts. The loan statements. The contract. Dad's letter. I watched the certainty drain from their lawyer's face as she realized they had no case. But the moment that struck me the most was when Mark picked up Dad's letter with trembling hands, eyes scanning the words that contradicted everything he had believed. He whispered, "Why didn't he tell us?" It wasn't anger anymore. It was grief. I felt something soften in me, not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. We had all lost the same father. We had all been shaped by him in different ways. And we were all struggling to reconcile the man we loved with the man who kept secrets. This was not a moment of triumph. It was a moment of truth. And truth, when spoken clearly, has a way of shifting everything. My siblings didn't apologize immediately. That would have required humility they weren't ready to embrace. But they withdrew their legal claim. Their lawyer advised them, firmly, that pursuing it further would result not only in a public loss, but in substantial financial penalties. Still, the real consequence wasn't legal. It was reputational. Our town is small. News spreads like wildfire, especially when it involves a long-standing family business. And though I never spoke a word to the public, people noticed the tension. They noticed who was doing the work. They noticed who had been doing it for decades. They noticed the siblings who had swooped in only when they believed profit was involved. Vendors who had known Dad for years quietly voiced their support. Customers lingered a little longer at the counter, asking gently if I was holding up all right. Even the employees, some of whom had worked there since my 20s, shook their heads and muttered, "They should have known better." My siblings were suddenly faced with the uncomfortable truth that their assumptions had made them look foolish, entitled, and reckless. The silent downfall wasn't about punishment. It was about clarity. They could no longer hide behind the idea that I had manipulated Dad. They could no longer claim innocence in their carelessness. They could no longer pretend they understood the sacrifices that had kept this place alive. The town saw me, not as the quiet daughter who stayed behind, but as the woman who saved a legacy they had all benefited from. And my siblings saw themselves, not as victims of injustice, but as spectators who tried to seize control of something they had never earned. And yet, even as their pride cracked, I found no satisfaction in watching them crumble. Only resolution. The truth had done what truth always does. It revealed. In the weeks that followed, the air slowly settled. My siblings kept their distance, retreating into their own lives, carrying with them the uncomfortable weight of everything they had assumed. The calls stopped. The angry emails ceased. The legal threats evaporated like fog in sunlight. The store, however, shifted around me in a subtle, steady way. Employees seemed more at ease. Customers lingered longer. The town began to treat me not simply as a placeholder for the Whitford name, but as its rightful steward. I renovated the storefront. I added a community tool library in Dad's honor. I installed new shelving, fresh lighting, and a small display of old photographs. Dad in his younger years, Mom behind the counter, the four of us kids posing awkwardly in front of a newly painted sign. I kept one photo for myself. A quiet one. Dad and me in the back office, both of us leaning over a ledger, the afternoon sun casting a tired glow across the pages. It reminded me of all the moments that built this legacy. Not the promise he broke, but the faith he placed in me long before any of us understood what that meant. My siblings never apologized directly. But one afternoon, months later, I received a letter in the mail. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting. It was from Mark. He wrote that he finally understood what Dad had done, and why. He wrote that he wished he had asked instead of assumed. He wrote that he hoped, one day, we could find a way back to each other. I didn't cry when I read it. I simply placed it in the same drawer where I kept Dad's letter. Families aren't perfect. They fracture. They heal. Sometimes they do both in the same breath. And for the first time in a long while, I felt free. Free from secrets. Free from guilt. Free to live my own life, not the version shaped by obligations and quiet sacrifices. And the business, my business, finally felt like mine. Not because Dad had sold it to me, but because I had earned it. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is not about inheritance, or paperwork, or even betrayal. It is about the danger of assumptions, the way they distort truth, warp memory, and poison relationships before a single word is spoken. My father kept a secret because he believed it protected us. Maybe he was right. Maybe he was wrong. But I have learned that secrets are burdens, not shields, and they always fall into the hands of the one most willing to carry weight. I carried it for years. And when it finally broke, I learned something I wish I'd understood sooner. Honesty cannot prevent pain, but silence guarantees it. My siblings and I may never return to the closeness we once shared, but we now stand on truth instead of misunderstanding. And that, in its own quiet way, is a kind of repair. So if you take anything from my story, let it be this. Family is not bound by promises spoken in confidence, but by courage spoken in clarity. And the truth, however late it arrives, has a way of setting everyone free.